Trying to prepare the live stream. It should go.
It says to me that it's now going.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Algaebased, and I'll be your host for today. I want to thank everyone who's starting to tune in live via YouTube. Don't forget that you can get in on the action with the chat sidebar on the right. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and of course, send in some questions. So it's always great to be able to continue doing these meetings in these strange times. Normally we'd be broadcasting live into classrooms across North America, but for now we're broadcasting into homes of parents, students, and educators. So it's really great to still be able to do these events. So we're really excited for today's event. Today we get to hang out with Kristina Libby. She is the Chief Science Industries and Artificial Intelligence and Emerging like Space, Climate Change, the Ocean, and Action.
Sort of explaining a little bit about me. So I'm just mentioning about the job that I have and what I academic scientist in sort of any different women in science. And as I was thinking about, what would be interesting to talk about from a climate change perspective and sort of a general, I just asked myself, how did I get to the job I have? And what is the way that maybe you can get into a science or a space related field with advanced science degree? And as I thought about it, it's really just about curiosity. Let's sort of, I think I can. What's the first?
Kristina, I hate to stop you, but even though it says the YouTube channel and we're not.
Oh no.
Let me see here. Your pants event. My name is Joe. Okay, sorry, Kristina, continue. It looks like it's live now. Okay, sorry to derail your train of thought.
That's okay. Are we starting from the beginning or are we starting from here?
No, go from here, yeah.
So sort of the way to think about this presentation is we're going to do two things. So I'm going to sort of share these secret mystery powers of question asking that I think everyone should think about as you're thinking about, do you want to career in space? Do you want to talk about climate change? And then we will open it up for some questions. And I actually have a special guest joining as well. So Noam Barzer is our climate change expert at Hypergiant. He also does lots of other work in this space and has an equally varied resume. And so he'll also answer some more specific questions, maybe directly about the people have them, and be able to share a little bit what we're working on that I'm really excited to give you a little later in the talk. So first, I think sort of the big secret about a job that allows you to have this really wide range of topics that you get to think about. I get to think about space and climate change. I get to think about defense and critical infrastructure, is to just be really curious. And that means sort of having this wide variety of topics that you are maybe interested in or that you want to explore or that you never really thought about. And so I did this really recently. I decided that I wanted to go to the Congo. And I decided that this is the thing I was going to do. I was going to go. And as I was planning my trip and thinking about it, I decided I really wanted to go to this one place. So I ended up going to one of only 5 active lava lakes in the world. And a lava lake is the top of a volcano. When you look in, I think we maybe all have this idea that the whole inside of the top of a volcano in an active lava lake is filled with lava, but it's not. It's actually a small part of the inside of the volcano is actually where you can see the lava kind of churning around and moving and breaking apart. And it's this really wonderful experience, right? It's really loud, it's really colorful, and it gets better sort of the later it is in the evening and the darker it gets. This is sort of what it looks like in the daytime, and then this is what it looks like in the evening. And I just wanted to kind of like have that experience of what's it like to see this weird, strange thing? What could I learn from it? What could I see? And ultimately, the experience of going to this volcano basically taught me nothing about my job at all. But it started to give me a little bit of a different perspective on the world. And the journey to do this actually brought me to Rwanda, where I was able to see all of these really beautiful gorillas. And this was, a big life highlight to be able to be that close to something that shares 98% of our DNA. But what was really interesting about the moment that I did it is that it was just the start of the coronavirus pandemic. And so as we went to see these gorillas, we actually had to wear masks over our face because we didn't know enough. We were really worried about transmission of the disease. And interestingly, in the Congo recently, there had been a outbreak of Ebola, which made it really dangerous and scary to go, but I still went all the same. And so there are a lot of measures in place in the Congo and in Rwanda to think about coronavirus, or for Ebola, that sort of helped us think about coronavirus. And so these photos are mine, these okay photos, and now I'm going to show you beautiful photos that a friend of mine took. So just to give him a little bit of credit, but we had this experience, right? Sort of all of a sudden I was doing something and I needed masks, and I was able to see actually an entirely different way that a community of people was looking at and thinking about pandemic and crisis. And when you're in Rwanda and the DRC and you're sort of going through these moments, any place you entered, there were hand washing stations everywhere, and there were sanitizers everywhere. And one night I went out to dinner and we walked in and we didn't wash our hands right away. And everyone sort of freaked out about it, right? Like a woman yelled at us. She sort of like sent us back out of the restaurant and we had to go wash our hands and come back. And it was this really interesting sort of moment where you started to see the way that an entirely different society operated in a pandemic moment. And then I came back to the US, and as I walked through border control or customs to get in at Atlanta, there was no hand washing stations, and there was no one taking my temperature, and there was no place to sort of find hand sanitizer, right? And it started to make me ask a bunch of different questions about how do we respond to crisis and how do we respond to panic, and then what could we do to kind of like activate in a different way. And it was one of those really interesting moments where I think just being curious about something like, how do I get to a lava lake and what does that look like and what's the experience, sort of helped me to start to think about what are other things that maybe other people are doing that we could apply here, and change the way we were dealing with our own crisis. And I think that question asking process, which is really an excuse to show you a lot of beautiful photos, was also an experience that I think is really natural to this process of curiosity, right? Like as we go in and we explore one thing, like a lava lake, we actually learn a bunch about something else, like a pandemic, which helps us then apply those ideas and thinking to other things that we're working on. So secret number 2 is to start with why questions. So one of the things I think when we're kids that we often kind of get told not to do is not to ask those why questions, right? We're like, why is the sky blue? But what is reflected light? But why should we think about that? And we often get stopped by society from asking those questions. And why questions are really, they're sort of a start into a line of scientific inquiry, right? Which is just like, why are things the way they are? And we can ask those questions about science, but we can ask those questions about anything. Why are there certain rules that we have? Why does society operate in a different way? And so we did that at Hypergiant with one of the climate change solutions that we've been working on. And so what started out to the CEO of Hypergiant, his name is Ben Lamb, and he had this question of, why aren't there more ways to address climate change? We basically, we're sort of hearing in kind of contemporary culture that it's like, you can plant more trees or you can cut carbon emissions. And we were just like, why? Like, why is that the conversation that everyone is having? And as we kind of went through that process, we asked about a lot of the different solutions that were out there. And one of the things that we sort of ended up zeroing in on was this idea of an algae-based bioreactor. So this idea isn't new. Bioreactors have been around for a long time. They are in universities primarily, and they're often very, very big. And they have all of these problems with algae, where algae growth is hard to control. It requires a lot of different factors. It's kind of messy. And it was like, there's nothing transportable about this. And so we were like, okay, well, algae bioreactors seem interesting, right? This is an interesting idea. But how could we make them be more relevant? Like why are they only in universities? Why aren't they in other places? And what we were able to do was to take this bioreactor, and basically the way it works is like dirty air comes in, and then in all of these tubes that you see over here, there's algae, And the algae eats this dirty air, and then it off puts it into a carbon, like a little disc, like a hockey puck. And so that's this sort of process at the very simplest way. And then we were able to optimize a bunch of things like air temperature, the amount of light, the pH of the water, in order to develop a process that was much more efficient than algae bioreactors that had been before. And then we were able to make it smaller and more modular with the idea that you could put them into office buildings or into condominiums, that you can maybe put them into your homes. And then we asked a question of like, why do we need to own this? Like, why does this need to be something that we do on our own? And we actually we're in the process of going to release these plans to the maker community to see if a bunch of people can do something different. And even that model of why do we have to keep all of this is sort of a central question about how do we actually change processes in different places. So this was sort of one thing that our why question took us to. And then sort of the second or the third big secret is about asking how questions. So probably one of the only reasons I have my job is because I ask a lot of how questions all the time. And I'm constantly obsessed with this idea of like, how can we make something better? So everything that we work on, everything we think about, whether it's something that is scientific, in the true sense of a science, or something that's maybe more socially scientific or something even personal, individual, is like, how do we actually go through this process and how do we make something that is maybe standard or already being done better? And so we have done a couple of things as a company. One of which is this disaster mapping system, which is a climate change solution that we developed using satellite imagery overlaid with machine learning. So essentially what happens is like, we think about climate change in a bunch of different ways, right? There's like the big problem of it, which is, there's too many carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and that's bad. And that's the most simple way to describe it on the planet. But right, so there's like a big problem, and we're like, okay, the bioreactor might be able to target part of that problem, may be able to sequester carbon and reduce sort of the overall problem. And then there's other parts of climate change, which are things like, because of climate change, we're seeing increases in weather phenomenon. That weather phenomenon is extreme, and an extreme version of that, and because it is extreme, it destroys property and it creates sort of mass catastrophes after things like mass flooding or hurricanes. The way that we respond to that right now is when there is a large scale destruction. Most of the way that we find people and we find building damage is through boots on the ground search and rescue, which means like people on a boat or on the ground, like going there and seeing out if there are any human lives. And so or if there are human lives to save, who's alive, who needs help, who needs food, water. And so what we did is we thought, well, what if we made it easier to get out there post-crisis event and be able to assess where the real damage is and how to triage systems. And so we built this tool, which takes satellite data from before and after the incident and then ranks it so you can see where the most extensive damage is, so that we can direct search and rescue teams to the most hard hit areas. Another example of something interesting that we're doing around climate change is we sort of wanted to know how to improve a bunch of different sort of experiences. One of which is we're seeing a lot of firefighters have to fight massive fires because fires are on the rise as a result of climate change. And the idea was, how can we try and save people's lives doing things like this? And so one of the things that our R&D department has been looking at is different types of helmets, sort of like Iron Man type helmets that have allow you to have sort of different mapping capacities immediately at your fingertips, so that rather than search for data, you have the right data you need at the right time to do the things that you need to do. And so we actually built this helmet for firefighters and first responders as a way to overlay a bunch of data in a specific scenario so that you are able to do something like fight fires more effectively and more efficiently. And then we are also developing sort of an interesting new tool that you can have a sneak peek at, and we can sort of talk about this in a lot more detail as well, which is, one of the sort of questions that we, one of pieces of news that has come out a lot in the past month, right? Is everyone is like, oh, the upside of COVID is that we're seeing all of this decrease in emissions, right? And that made the news kind of everywhere. And I think a lot of us, kind of absorbed that in, and we all thought really positively, like, oh, maybe this is really great for the atmosphere. And so we actually built a simulator that is looking at the impact that things like the stay-at-home quarantine are having on carbon emissions. And what's the truth of it is that it's not, and I will let Noam explain this more sort of, actually, do you want to talk about it right now? Like maybe just for a few minutes and then we can come back to it.
Yeah.
This is Noam's tool. He's
hi, everybody.
He's a real expert on it.
So you may have seen or you may not have seen, but if you want to look it up, it's easy to find. Some visualizations that were made with satellite imagery that show it looks like clouds of emissions disappearing over cities. And it's my job to pay attention to what people are saying about climate change. And I noticed that all over the internet, people were seemingly under the impression that because these clouds of emissions were disappearing, that COVID-19, this pandemic, was somehow having a positive effect, that there was maybe a silver lining that was having a positive effect on climate change, which was a little bit concerning to me because there are some mathematical realities that make that not necessarily true. Not necessarily untrue, it just depends on how long the behaviors that have led to those emissions decreases last. So short-term pauses in emissions, like the ones that you can see in those visualizations, they have very little effect on the average global temperature over time. And the basic scientific reason for that is that emissions are cumulative. So you can think about it this way. Let's say you were born in 1995 and your parents drove you back home from the hospital. Some of the emissions from that trip back from the hospital, from that car trip, are still up in the atmosphere. And then the next year, emissions from those trips are still out. And so they build on top of each other. And so turning off the tap on those emissions just for a second doesn't actually decrease the total amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere all that much. If you want to do that, you have to turn off the tap for a much longer period of time. But it got us thinking, and I'm sure all of you are experiencing this a little bit yourselves, we've all changed our behavior a lot in order to respond to this crisis. We're staying at home. I'm sure some of your parents are home with you right now. You're staying home from school. And that means people are driving a lot less, and it means people are flying a lot less. And it means that certain types of businesses which aren't operating are having deliveries scheduled much less frequently. And so all of that stuff has an impact on the climate. And we were wondering what it would look like if we learned some lessons about what is possible in terms of how we live our lives, how we work, how we organize school, how we organize the office place, and what happens if we made those behavioral changes long-term. What would that do to emissions? And so what this simulator does is it allows you to play, and these are what the toggles are that you're seeing on the right. It allows you to play with certain behaviors. And this is just showing a few of them. So working from home, or adding solar capacity to the United States as a way to put people back to work, because some people have lost their jobs because of the COVID crisis. And it allows you to play with those behaviors in terms of percentages of people doing them, and see what they do to this big blob of emissions in the center. And so you'll see that you've got your big cloud of emissions, and then you'll see two rings. And then the inner ring it's a barrier, it represents a limit. And so if you see that cloud past that barrier, it means that we've passed a point at which we've acknowledged it's a goal really, that we've acknowledged that we need to hit in order to keep our planet safe and habitable. And so this represents the Paris agreements. This was a political treaty that the United States signed and is still technically in under the Obama administration, that committed us to lowering our emissions a certain percentage, in this case 26%, below 2005 levels. And so if you play with these toggles, you can see whether or not you can stay within those safe boundaries, or whether or not you're on track to be closer to the outer circle, which is where we're projected to be in 2025 when our first commitment gets evaluated.
Yeah, and so that, oh, sorry, just to interrupt you for a moment, and then we can go back to questions about this. And so essentially what we're trying to do with this tool, right, is answer this how question of, how do we actually do what we think we're doing right now, which is like, how do we actually make sure that the activities we're doing are having a bigger impact on climate change? And how do we make sure that there really is a lot of science behind that it's not just sort of what we're seeing? So just to kind of take you through the very last point in sort of these secrets are, I think the fourth thing we have to think about is we have to hang out with people who are wildly curious. Right? We have to learn from their questions, that we have to find those people who sort of maybe think in a weird way or think differently, and we have to follow them. And those are the kinds of weird thinkers who actually change the world. And I work, this is Ben Lamb, he's the CEO of Hypergiant, who I work with very closely every day. And we sort of have these favorite questions that we like to ask each other as we're thinking about new projects or we're thinking about things that we want to take on. And I would kind of encourage you to all think about them as you think about your career and what you want to do. And these questions are things like why isn't that product from a movie a real thing, right? That is actually how we started a lot of this helmet work, is because we were like, why doesn't the Iron Man helmet exist? Like, do we have the technology to do that? Why can't we make that a real thing? We often ask questions about why do things only have two sides to the argument? That's how we got to the EOS bioreactor. We spend a lot of time thinking about how something would change in space. So by 2024, we're going to put people on the moon again. NASA wants to have a base on the moon by 2028. So doing things in space is going to become a bigger reality. And when we ask these questions about space, it often changes how we do them in the world. And that sort of corresponds to this question of like, how will we do something in 20 years? Do we expect to walk to the store? Do we expect to have food delivered? Do we expect to have food delivered in space? And one of my favorite questions we spend a lot of time asking is, what does impossible actually mean to you? So a lot of the times people will say, oh, we can't do that, it's impossible. And often when you sort of break down impossible, what you learn is that it's a question of time, or it's a question of money, or it's a question of interest, and that basically nothing is truly impossible, but it's often hard. And so the question that we really spend a lot of time getting over is why is this too hard? How can we make it easier? How can we make it less impossible? So those are just a little bit of way of sort of how I think I wound up here is not necessarily from anything else than just being obscenely curious at all times about all things. So I think there are questions. I don't know because I can't see, but Joe, are there questions that we can dig into and answer?
All right. Well, first of all, Kristina, thank you so much. Noam, thank you as well. I love your secrets. I think they're the perfect secrets that kids need to be thinking about, especially the staying curious and asking those hard questions. Asking those questions, maybe if they are a little bit weird, but sometimes having those conversations can lead to really great innovation. So thank you so much for sharing some of those secrets with us today. All right. Oh, there we go. I was just going to ask you to come back from the screen share, but you beat me to it. All right, so another shout out to YouTube. Don't forget to use the chat sidebar on the right to send us in some questions. And in fact, we'll start off with one here from Sarah in Costa Rica. So Sarah's wondering about university titles or, initials after your name. How important is that for getting involved in science or climate change projects or finding jobs?
So this is interesting. So I have a master's degree. I have a master's degree in international security, and I spent the majority of my master's time studying genocide. And now I work in an entirely related field. So I think Noam also has a master's degree. His is specifically in climate change, which is helpful for his doing climate change work. And I've taught at both NYU and the University of Florida. And so there are two ways to answer this question. One, if you want to go into do very specific scientific research, I think that you have to have those academic credentials. If you want to work in science in various, like there are so many capacities to work in this space, right? And so for me, my academic credentials, I think, just prove that I have the ability to think to other people who maybe questioned whether or not I thought or could think in a sort of academic or sustained or longer process about things, rather than it being a necessity to get my job. Although I will say that it has always helped me. So I think my short answer is that it's helpful for all future jobs. I think education and continuing education is incredibly valuable. I think if you want to work very specifically in a disciplined field of science, that's even more important. I mean, I would go back to school tomorrow if given the opportunity. So,
and I would say it's important, but it's not the only thing that's important. You go and get a master's in climate studies like I did, and it's a really efficient, really fast way to expose yourself to a lot of people who have been thinking about this kind of thing for a long time. And it's sort of like a booster. It'll get you there really quick. And then there are some just practical realities when you're applying for jobs. It's something that people look for. They want to make sure you've had that experience. But an equally important experience is out in the field. It's what you've done in research, which doesn't always necessarily correlate to what you're doing in school. It's what you've done maybe in parts of your life that weren't even related to what you're studying, that turn out to be related later. And that happens to me all the time. This is the third career I've had. So I've changed a few times. I've gone from media communications in the Obama administration to healthcare policy expert, and then to climate change. And working in healthcare policy, you wouldn't necessarily think is related to climate change, and I didn't get a degree in that, but I use it every day. And so it's one thing that's important, but experience is also important.
All right. I think those are some awesome points, particularly that, there isn't a right or wrong way to get into a field or into science, and that you might start in one field and find yourself in a completely different one. You should kind of chase your passion and go after what makes you excited, as well, because having a job that you're excited and passionate about doesn't always feel like work.
Although it still can feel like work. There's still a lot of work to it.
That's true, but at least you enjoy what you're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. It sounds to me like your meetings are probably a lot of fun, batting around ideas, kind of getting a little wild with some of the ideas or things you've seen. So how does something go from an idea to something you're actually going to pursue? Because we saw a lot of cool projects like the helmet, the disaster relief, the bioreactors. How does something go from the idea to that next step, something you're going to pursue?
It's interesting. We ask a bunch of questions around value. So there's a lot of ideas, right? There's like a million great ideas all the time, but there's only a certain amount of time that we have, and there's only a certain amount of money that we have to pursue these ideas. And then there's certainly sort of a certain amount of interest by the public, right? So there are cool things you can make that no one will ever care about, which doesn't mean you shouldn't make them. That just is one path. For us as a company, we're really focused on making a big impact, right? Like what are ideas that we can do that can sort of help to change the world? And so that means that we have to think about cool ideas. And then we have to think about ideas that can make a really broad change, either not necessarily like a physical change in the way we do things, but often a lot of the times we think about like changing people's minds about stuff. So when we started the idea about the bioreactor, yes, we thought the project was important, and yes, we thought it was valuable and useful to develop it. But we also wanted to sort of challenge the conventional thinking we were seeing everywhere, which is like, there aren't just two sides to this argument. We need to insert a third option that could be viable and interesting, and kind of see how people respond to it, right? Like part of the way our company works is we like to put a bunch of ideas out there, and then we also like to see what people think about them before we spend a huge amount of time and money going and further developing those ideas into real products. I think when we first launched the bioreactor, we thought, this is probably something that we could productize and sell, but we also thought, well, let's share it with the world first and see what everyone thinks of our ideas. And I think that's this whole thing about ideas is, Noam and I actually had this conversation a lot when he first started working here, was that it's okay to have ideas that aren't fully formed, and to just sometimes toss them out and see how people respond to them, right? Like, we don't have to have everything solved all the time. That there is sort of this beautiful interplay in having something that is an idea and then sort of seeing how other people think, and then incorporating their feedback into your idea and working on it, and sort of continuing to evolve it. And so that's a big part of what we do as well, which is sometimes we just want to throw you for a little loop or surprise you with something, and see if you want to get on board.
Yeah. And some of it is just embracing the idea that if you play around with something and you may not know even what problem you're solving, it's just a cool idea. We know algae can eat carbon dioxide. We know they can do it very efficiently. Maybe we don't know much more than that. Let's just put them in a tube, feed them some carbon dioxide, build some algorithms that control the conditions in the tube, and see what happens. And we allow ourselves the space to play around with that, because sometimes when you play around with things, even if you don't really know what the result will be, it can surprise you, and you can look at it and you can say, that turns out to be a much more efficient solution than anything that's out there. Or it turns out to be a solution to a problem, but not the one we were trying to solve, different problem. And then you end up going down down that path, and then you can start building structure around it and deciding whether or not it's a worthwhile path to pursue. But in order to get there, often you just have to play around. And one of the nice things about working for a company like Hypergiant is, I'd say more than any other company I've worked for, very supportive of that idea of research through play. Just being curious and seeing what happens if you add this to that. So it's a lot of fun, and it can lead to some really interesting insights and discoveries.
All right, very cool. Well, I want to peel back a little more of the bioreactor, because it looks like such an amazing project, an amazing product that you're working on. Is that something that's still in development, or something that you've started, putting out there that people can purchase? Or
You can't buy it, and you, as an individual person, may never be able to buy it from us. We will outsource open source the plans, so that there will be a community of people who can make them and make them at home, and you can probably get one in your home. That's not to be said that we will not ever do that, but it's up for debate. But right now we are in the process of making units that we can work with governments and cities and companies to test in their environments, so that we can start to get in more data to further develop the product, and then to actually get out there in the market, so that we're able to put it into the whole slew of solutions for climate change. Like, we don't think that this will not solve our carbon crisis, but it is a step and a product and a different way of thinking about things. And so we're working with a number of different cities and different governments to try and start prototype programs, so we can really test it.
Yeah, and I think that's an awesome point. Is there is no silver bullet. There's not going to be a magical solution. It's going to take a lot of people working together, a lot of different ideas on small scales, large scales, community level. Climate change isn't something that we're going to be tackling with one idea.
Because we don't tackle anything with one idea, right? Like, I think that's all of the, we look at all the sort of the big systems that we have everywhere in the world, and there's a million ways to solve any problem, right? And so I think that's one of the things that we often forget, that we're in sort of a polarized world, right? And so we're like, it has to be this or this. And it's like, no, it's actually like this and this and this and this and this. And one of the interesting things I think we're seeing now at sort of this moment is we're starting to see a lot of companies get involved in the conversation and start to have a lot more awareness about the role that they can play. And they were seeing like Microsoft just did a big thing about that, where you're just seeing it everywhere. You're seeing it from banks, and you're seeing government get more involved, and then you're seeing individual citizens get more involved. And that's really exciting, right? Because that means lots of solutions, lots of ideas. I think this specific moment we're in, this pandemic moment, is such proof positive of what we can do when we as humanity all want to work together against a specific set goal, right? Like we are seeing scientists work on all kinds of different solutions across all kinds of different industries collectively and together in pursuit of this one of stopping this pandemic moment, right? And so, that's great and that's exciting. And I think that shows us something about humans and humanity and our power to work together that we maybe often forget as we're sort of divided in our own, other moments of crisis. And I think it's a model that hopefully we can apply to what's happening from a climate change perspective as well. Because if we moved with the same speed and the same ingenuity and the same desire, I think we could find ourselves in a really different place 5 or 10 years from now.
All right. So I've got a question here from Rabia, and they're wondering, we did mention that there's lots of solutions. Everybody can play a role. So they're wondering about things you do on a day-to-day basis to maybe help mitigate your footprint or your impact on the climate.
Mm-hmm. You want to take this one?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. I can share my things, but I think you're much more effective, much more knowledgeable.
Maybe. So there are a few things that I've been doing and a few things that I plan to be doing. So one of the most, I used to eat a whole lot of meat. And so for me, that was a big part of my carbon footprint. And I'm not a vegetarian right now, but I would say I probably reduced the amount of meat I eat by 80%. And when I go about calculating my own carbon footprint, that's a big slice of the pie. And it's a thing, if you come from a family that consumes a lot of meat, especially red meat, like, beef, cattle, stuff like that, that's part of it. I think a lot harder about where my food comes from, how it was grown, but also how it gets to me. So the carbon footprint of an apple that's grown in my backyard is much lower than the carbon footprint of an apple that's grown 5 states away, because it didn't have to be transported here on a truck that's emitting carbon. So I make an effort to buy local, which I'm lucky enough to be able to do. Sometimes that's a little bit more expensive, but if you can do it, it's something to consider. And so those are big things. I think very hard before I take a flight. I do still fly, but I fly less. That's a big part of my carbon footprint. And I think just generally about waste a lot harder. Do I really need to buy this shirt, or will it just sit in my closet and I'll just buy another shirt because this one didn't do what I wanted it to do? Do I have to throw it out, or can I mend this, right? So getting in the mindset where you're thinking about whether or not something is really disposable, whether or not you really need material that might have a high carbon footprint is really important.
I have just sort of 2 things to add to that. So I try and read a lot. So I try and make sure that I am not sort of giving wrong information about all of this when people ask me. And there are 2 good books. So We Are the Weather. I actually don't know how no one feels about either of these books, but I'm recommending We Are the Weather because I think it's interesting. It talks a lot about this idea of eating less meat, and it's quite easy to read. I think at sort of like grade 6 and above reading level. There's also this book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which is quite is really beautifully and exceptionally written. I know Noam has some thoughts about this book, but I think it's a good primer. And I think I would say probably like a 7th or 8th grade reading level and above, but it's very good for helping you to conceptualize the entire problem, right? So like, what do I do individually? I read a lot of books so that I better understand the problem, so that when people want to talk to me about what's happening from a climate change perspective, I can talk about it with people. And then I share a lot of that information as well, right? So I read things and I tell other people. And I think that's something that, y'all are on social media, make a TikTok video about climate change. Like, there's all of this stuff that we can do so that we're helping to educate and share information with each other so that we can learn other things to do. And I will admit that I still take a lot of flights. I just went to Africa, which has a big impact on the environment. And I will probably be someone who takes a lot of flights for my life. And that's part of who I am. And I understand that that's not awesome, right? But I did recently learn how to buy like carbon offset credits to try and like make up for some of the flights I take as well, which is also something that like I am lucky enough to be able to buy these flights and then to be able to sort of like offset the impact. And I think there's a lot of questions about the carbon offset market that I still have, but that it's valuable to think about that too. So like, are there things that are still really important to your life that you want to do? And is the way that you can negate the impact? Because I think for me, traveling to the Congo and going to see these gorillas and spending money at this national park and donating to this national park, which has actually like a big impact. Virunga National Park is a massive tract of land in Africa, and the efforts to support the park actually do a lot to sort of make sure that its habitat stays intact. All of those trees are good for us, and helping that community is good for the world. And so how do I sort of do those things that I think benefit other parts of the world, but also make sure that what I'm doing isn't hurting the world at the same time? I try and think about that.
Yeah, I'm glad we swung back to that trip, because there's a question that I'd like to ask about. We see one version of Rwanda or the DRC in the media, and it's often, the media likes to portray the bad. But you were there, you were on the ground, you saw the beautiful country, you met the people. What would you tell people about a country like Rwanda and the DRC?
So I went to the DRC because I like to go places that everyone doesn't go, right? And I mean, and we, you go, and I traveled with this friend of mine, and we were both supposed to go to the DRC, and he sends me the State Department warning, and it says, don't go to Goma, don't go to the DRC unless you've prepared a will, and you are like prepared for that situation. And so he ended up not going. And I was really nervous when I got to the border, and I was like, have I made some terrible decision? Like, there was an active Ebola case here. There was still an active Ebola case, although they think the last one. And there is a lot of reports about militia attacks, rebel attacks. There is a lot of poverty and insecurity. And my experience in Goma, though, was that I was met at the border by the Virunga National Park Park Service, who then escorted me to the national park, to sort of this experience where you get to hike the volcano. So it was, for me, very, very safe, because they're very concerned about tourism. It's would I recommend going to Goma and just sort of like wandering around by yourself? No, but I will say this, that we have to take the risks we're comfortable with in order to do the things that satisfy us. And so, yeah, the Congo is a really dangerous place in the world. Is it an active war zone? No. Is it an active zone with rebel militias who have a long-standing grudge with each other, and not a lot of vocal efforts to resolve that? Yes. And so we need to be concerned about those things. But at the same time, if we don't go to some of these places and we don't put our money there and our time there and our advocacy there, then those places get destroyed. And so it's a question of what do you stand for? How much personal risk are you willing to take? And where do you want to put your money? That being said, Rwanda is like the safest country right now in Africa. It is the safest country for women to travel on her own. They have roads that are better paved than the roads of my home state of Maine, and it's very safe to get around. Everyone is concerned about and catering to you, and the country has undergone a huge amount of reconciliation and peace building following the 1994 genocide. And so it's safe, but what do you see? You see people who are living off less than $1 a day, right? And you see environments that are harder than your daily life. And you see some of the most beautiful natural habitat in the world. And you also deeply understand that the news media gives you the sensational news that they want to give you, and that the human stories about I walked out of a hotel one night and to this little town and met 15 kids who were all studying at the tourism school, who email me 3 times a week because they want to practice their English, right? And so humans are humans everywhere, and most people are trying to be good, and most places are relatively safe, and lots of places are risky, and it's hard to give people advice on what to do, except for I would say that going to Mount Congo was one of the most beautiful, incredible things I've ever seen in my entire life, and I don't regret it for a moment, and I think the risk for me was worth it.
Awesome.
So that's a long answer.
No, awesome. I love it. I'm so glad that you shared, that perspective, your experience with us. I think it's really important. And so Kristina and Noam, the last question I want to ask, usually we end off with advice for future explorers or scientists, but I think you did a really good job of that with your secrets when you shared that during your presentation. So instead, I want to hear from each one of you, because I think everybody has somebody growing up who inspires them. For me, it was Jacques Cousteau and David Attenborough. So is there a scientist or an explorer or somebody who inspired or inspires you?
Noam, do you want to go first? Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, you're still on? Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm a Carl Sagan fanatic. Carl Sagan passed away, but his daughter still writes and his wife still writes, and I still pay close attention to them and find them very inspiring. And Carl Sagan was the first person that showed me that not only is science not necessarily what I was sometimes taught it was in school, which is like rote memorization and equations and just math, but that those things like math and equations are tools that you use to do something much more grand and extravagant, which is explore the universe. And that scientists are adventurers, that they often live out on the edge of glaciers, that they're people who take sometimes big risks because they're just really driven to know the answer. And they live sort of often very wild, exciting lives. And I didn't know that about science, and I sort of got pulled into it, and I've been doing it ever since. And he's just a beautiful writer and a beautiful communicator, and more than anybody else, somebody who's really capable of revealing the beauty of the natural world on paper in a way that I think is quite unique.
Yeah, and he had a pretty incredible responsibility pulling together the golden discs that were sent out in Voyager. So that's pretty wild.
He did.
All right, very cool. Good choice. What about you, Kristina?
Okay, so I love polar explorers. Like, I just think that they are like the most fascinating. So I've read every book about polar explorers. So probably Amundsen is my favorite, but that's because I'm Swedish and he's Norwegian, and I like feel like there's like something there. But I think the thing about polar explorers that's fascinating is that they literally go to like the coldest, most brutal, like inhospitable place in the world, and they just try and conquer it, right? It is this sort of like amazing test of the human spirit, but in the sense of it is all mental. Like, I mean, it's physical, it's like very cold and freezing and whatever, but like ultimately you are committing to living like 50 days in basically like endless white nothingness. And the mental capacity to be able to have like to do that, to just go out there and think like, I'm going to make it to the North Pole, or I'm going to make it to the South Pole, and I'm going to like go in a place where there's literally nothing I can live off of, and in a temperature that is like not meant to sustain human life, and I'm still going to try and like do this one grand thing. I think there's like a real sort of beauty and possibility in that I think says something really incredible about the human spirit, right? Like, that's why space exploration is really interesting, which is like, if you want to test your body and your mind as far as it can go, then like there are very few places you can do that. We all live these really cozy, comfortable lives, but the moment we're put against that hardship, I think it exposes really fascinating things about who we are. And I think polar explorers show us that in a way that few others do.
All right, I love it. Two very different choices, but two very good examples. And I live in a little town just outside of Toronto, and it's a tourist town in the summers.
What town?
Elora.
Okay. Yeah. I go to Toronto a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So this guy's name's Ian. He's a friend of mine, and so he was training to ski to the South Pole, and so he'd go through town in the middle of the summer with a tractor tire behind him and like with his poles, and that's how he trained to carry the big sleds. So I'm sure the tourists thought he was crazy, but he went out and he did it. He made a little documentary, and for a time he was the oldest Canadian to have ever skied to the South Pole. So I mean, yeah, I mean it takes a huge amount of training and preparation and then that mental to get through it, but pretty incredible.
I'm sure the tourists just thought it was Canadians doing what Canadians do. I lived in Halifax. That's where I did my undergrad. And I feel like I could imagine someone just being like, those Canadians, like, look at the effort they're putting into, yeah, I'm gonna be here, it's funny. But just, yeah, it's amazing, all of those people.
Yeah, very cool. Well, first of all, I want to do big shout out to YouTube. Thanks so much for sending the questions. Thanks to everybody who'll be tuning into the event throughout the day. And then Noam and Kristina, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today to share some really cool projects that Hypergiant is working on. And I think those secrets that you shared, Kristina, are the perfect things that kids should be thinking about right now. We are in a challenging time right now, but it's a great time to be curious, to learn something new, to think about new ideas, and to innovate. So I really appreciate stealing some of both of your times today.
Thank you for having us. Have a good day.
All right, awesome. Thanks, everyone. We're going to sign off for today.